This is going to be one heck of a review, ladies and gentlemen. We're going to be reviewing both of the brand new 2025 ROG Flow Z13 tablets. These are housing the brand new Strix Halo parts. These are monster APUs, which feature 256-bit wide memory that we are going to test and show you how bandwidth scales, even down all the way to 10 watt. We're going to go through how they achieve getting better battery life and better performance down to 10 watt and show you how they're achieving that. And spoiler, it's pretty much exactly how I said they should do it for an Xbox handheld almost 2 years ago. We'll go over that and specifically how technically they are doing it. I think AMD could do a better job. It kind of seems like they're doing it in a way that is a little bit automated. They're interpolating a lot of frequency to average out frequency, and rather than fine-tuning memory clocks and voltage. So we'll touch more based on that in the review itself. Now, effectively, both of these tablets are essentially the same. The only thing that's different between them is the APU that is on them and the memory configuration, which only exists on the Max Plus 395 version. Both of them have 256-bit wide buses, so they both have that super wide bandwidth that we're going to go over in detail in this video just in a few more minutes. So why would someone want to get a 128 gigabyte version? Well, I think a lot of people are probably eyeing this up specifically for AI purposes, where they're going to be able to fit large AI models inside of that 128 gigabyte model. With that, and especially having that 40C GPU port, as ROG gets more and more support, that's going to look like a fantastic device to have local models that could do a lot of damage, especially with how much power and horsepower you got in these APUs. They are gigantic monsters, and I had already gone over this in the preview, but if we go into the specs of them, largely they are similar. If we first take a look at the display, they are what Asus calls their ROG Nebula displays. They're both 13.4-inch IPS 180 Hz panels with 3 millisecond response times. They are 16 by 10 panels. Their resolution is 2560 by 1600. They have touch and pen input support. For what it's worth, the two models that I got, they did not come with a pen, although I do have a pen that has worked on them, so that can work, but do not anticipate it being included in the box. At least it wasn't so far for me. All of the models are 1.2 kilograms, or effectively 2.6 pounds. They're 12 millimeters thin. All of them have a 70 watt-hour battery. They all have Wi-Fi 7 connectivity. They have the same ROG intelligent cooling. For what it's worth, the cooling that I have done, now this should be self-evident as we go up there, because a lot of my tests go up to 80 watts. 80 watts is pretty much the absolute peak of where you can take this device, so don't anticipate going much further than that unless you're going to be doing something exotic. But 70 watt is, I would say, most often easy enough to achieve. And so I'm of mixed minds on this. I don't really think that this monster APU, the Max Plus 395, should have been in a tablet with like a removable type cover keyboard attachment. I think that this should have been like a 16-inch laptop, something that is far more of like a workstation. The one benefit that I will say about a tablet is that because of the kickstand type of how you're going to use this, generally speaking, the inlet where air is going to come into the device is always going to be on the back of the device rather than, face down either on your lap or on a table where there's going to be less air going to be able to come in. So there is a benefit to a tablet-like design just because air is more often than not going to be having a lot of air going to be able to come into the device. So that's the only thing I could say about it, but it's a little bit odd to have this monster of a chip in a tablet. But it exists. The last parts that we need to talk about insofar as the sameness of them. So regardless of model of what you're going to get, both of them have two USB 4. They are PD and DP compliant. So DisplayPort out through there. You have one USB-A 3.2 Gen 2 port, so your standard USB-A port. There is one full-fat HDMI 2.1 port. There is a microSD card reader, so that's your expansion slot. And then there is a 4-pole 3.5 millimeter audio jack. The last bits on there that are important is the front-facing camera, which is a 5 megapixel IR camera for Windows Hello. And then there's a 13 megapixel camera on the back if you wanted to take nice pictures because it's a tablet, which, cool. So that's largely the specs of it. Now, there is a lot of detail in this review. I would dare say that I am going to have pretty much exclusive data considering all the different devices that are out there, because I would wager that I'm one of the only people that have taken control of the device and pushed it to any TDP arbitrarily that I wanted to. I've taken this down to 5 watt for CPU benchmarks. I have changed EPP modes from 0 for CPU benchmarking in Cinebench, going to EPP 90. I digress a bit. There is going to be a whole chapter in this particular video showing my testing methodology and what I used to set up the machine and how I did everything. The other part that we're going to be looking at is, because I can arbitrarily set the TDP to whatever I want, the battery life that I've been able to achieve out of this is going to be much, much better than what pretty much every reviewer is going to be able to get. I've been able to get 9 hours of battery life on the Max Plus 395. And that is by pushing the power all the way down to 4 watt. Even going on to 4 watt, it was still taking around 7 watt on package. But because of the silent mode that I was in, Asus does this really neat thing where if it's under a certain temperature threshold, the fan doesn't even kick on. So if the fan isn't on, then I'm saving power from there as well. So it's really, really power saving and really, really good. We'll go over that in the battery life segment of this, but there's tons of information that we have to talk about. I have done 300 different benches, 300 cumulative benches on Cinebench 2024, going from 5 watt all the way up to 80 watt in single core and multi-core. Now, single core is probably silly because after around 20 watt, we kind of flatline, but I just let it run because I didn't feel like changing it at all or messing around with the automation. So I just let it run. Effectively, it took 36 hours, 18 hours each for each platform. Is 150 benches per platform, 300 benches in total to create 2 graphs. So it's a bunch of benchmarks just to create 2 graphs. I'm going to have those. I say it later on, but I'm going to have those on my Patreon initially so that all the data will be available for you guys to digest. I'll have it on Twitter later on. I should really make a website, but that is for later. Carrie to figure out. We're also going to be looking at pushing this device low and comparing it to handhelds. Now, this is something that I've long said has been possible. In fact, when I talked about an Xbox Handheld, everything that I said is true. Now, how AMD does it is a little bit lazy insofar how they're kind of calibrating the memory clock. But everything I said before, when we have a 256-bit wide memory interface, what we can do is we can just push LPDDR5X to its lowest memory frequency, thus getting the same exact bandwidth that handhelds would get at 800 megahertz because they're 128-bit wide. But we're going to be able to do that at 400 megahertz. And how AMD does that is they oscillate their clock from like 400 megahertz to 800 megahertz to interpolate a frequency to average out where that frequency is going to be. There is a cost penalty for this, obviously, because you have to pay for the voltage to spike up there rather than just defining a clock rate and then tuning in a voltage for that. So AMD could still make this platform a whole lot better, but I'm going to be able to show you that this can go low, and I do compare it to handheld-like chips, so like AMD's 8840U and the latest AMD Strix Point, the HX370. So we're going to be looking at it from 15 watt, 20 watt, and 25 watt on 8840U, and 15 watt and 20 watt on the HX370. So we're going to look at gaming benchmarks, synthetic gaming benchmarks, Cinebench. We're doing the whole gamut here so you can have a holistic view of everything. Then I also do the 390 versus the 395 at 1080p with like max settings on GPU. And we're pushing the 35, 45, and 55 watt so that you can see the entire range that this device has. And it really is a fantastic chip. It can go really low. It can go really high. It's just really sensational. Also, with Asus's silent profile, it can be rather silent. And I would almost posit that most people should be running in silent mode until you actually need all that horsepower. So let's go ahead and get into it. We're first going to be going into the testing methodology, and then we're going to start going into bandwidth so that you have a good idea of how all that kind of shakes out, because that is going to define how everything else works. Then we're going to go into the synthetic gaming benchmarks, then into the synthetic Cinebench. Then we're going to go into the gaming benchmarks. Then we're going to go into my final review talking about just the device in general, not just the performance parts of it. So let's get into it. In this part of the video, we're going to be talking about my testing methodology that I used on AMD Strix Halo. This is both for the 390 and the 395 Plus. So what we're doing here is there are effectively 2 different modes that we're running these in, and these are the modes that I'm doing, so this will help you better replicate what I was doing per watt. Now, in here, you can see that I have EPP 90. Now, in all of my Cinebench 2024 tests for both the 395 Plus and the 390, what I was actually doing was setting EPP to 0. Now, what's nice is that in Asus's own utility, which you can see right here, all of these power configs that you see on the bottom, Windows, Silent, Performance, Turbo. So I did manual just so that I could make my own fan curve, and I basically just made it max out so that I could try to limit any type of thermal problem that might arise while doing the testing. So I try to limit the thermals as much as I can this way. Now, when we do this manual mode, effectively in Power CFG, that is effectively the turbo mode. You can see PD turbo mode right here. I am charging via USB-C. So that PD turbo mode is what you see there. So if I were to go back into this utility, you can see right here that EPP is 0. So why do we want EPP 0? EPP 0 effectively tells the operating system that we want to, whatever power we have, we should be pushing as much of that power to the CPU as possible. EPP 0 is also a terrible setting if we were trying to be doing game benches on the APU itself, because if we were constantly trying to push power to the CPU, obviously we'd be strangling the GPU a bunch, and that's not what we want to do, which is why when I do my tests for game benches, I actually change them to EPP 90. So you can see right here, I'm going to go and select G, and we're going to make my EPP mode 90. So you can see the current EPP mode right here is 90. And if we were to go back to the main menu, you can see that EPP is 90 as well. For my testing methodology for gaming benchmarks, like I've already said, I do EPP 90 mode. So we're trying to restrict power on the CPU, especially when I'm doing lower TDP tests. So when I'm doing 15 watt, 20 watt, 25 watt, we really want to be considerate of how much power we're pushing to the CPU and trying to get more power to Encore and GPU. But the other thing that I do is I set the dedicated VRAM. So I'm slicing off of the shared memory that we have, the 32 gigs of system memory that we have on these systems. I'm putting 8 gigs of reserved RAM, which is reserving 8 gigs of VRAM on each machine. So that's both the same. Additionally, when we take a look at some other settings that I've done here, you can see that I have core isolation disabled and the latest drivers that I have available, which are still preview drivers for Halo Strix. So you can see right here that the BIOS version that I have is 3.04, and I'm using the Asus Strix Halo PI FP11 1.0.0.0.a. So that is basically my testing methodology for these particular systems so that I could align them as close as possible. We're trying to make CPU benches as best as possible, and we're also trying to make gaming benches as best as possible. And that is the configuration that I have set for those systems, and that is my testing methodology for these particular systems. All right, we're really going to be getting into the meat and potatoes of how the Strix Halo 390 and 395 work, especially because I'm likely going to be one of the only tech reviewers that is looking at very low TDP on this platform, and specifically how bandwidth works when we push these platforms into very low TDP. And what's interesting is it's exactly what I said we should be doing 2 years ago when I talked about the Xbox Handheld. If we have 256-bit wide memory, that means that we can clock the LPDDR5X to its lowest basement frequency, which is effectively 400 megahertz. 256-bit wide at 400 megahertz is the same as 800 megahertz at 128-bit wide, or 6400 megatransfers. So we effectively have the same bandwidth, but we're able to save power because the memory is going at its very low power, and the memory controller, which shares a clock domain with the memory, is also running at lower power. So we're using less power on package, giving more power for the rest of the system to work. Now, we have an interposer and a bunch of other stuff that's running on this chip because Strix Halo is a gigantic monster. But when we do all this, we can still get the platform very, very low. Now, we're going to start at 10 watts so that you can see what happens. Now, if we take a look above me, you can see CPU package power, and over there, you can see memory frequency. Now, already you can see what's going on. Now, AMD does this with GPUs as well, and I'm not a fan of it. I think that this should be tuned up a lot more, and it's kind of just I would assume an easier way for AMD to figure out what's going on. But effectively, if we zoom in over here, you can see that at 10 watt TDP, you can see that the memory clock is at 399 megahertz or 400 megahertz, but you can see that it spikes up to 800 megahertz from time to time. What that means is that AMD is basically opportunistically bumping up to 800 megahertz, but it is interpolating and averaging out the frequency of the memory. So it's trying to get more work done inside of that, trying to get more bandwidth while still trying to save on power. So basically you're interpolating that frequency by just oscillating to these high and lows. Now, voltage wise, I don't think that it's optimal. I think having just a set low frequency and tuning voltage is the obvious way to go. So we have like a poor man's implementation here. So we could 100% get much better results if this was fine-tuned, but we'll see how AMD handles it. So let's start stepping through this video. So you can see at 9 watt, 10 watt, we're oscillating between 400 megahertz and 800 megahertz, right? So it goes up and down. But then as soon as we hit 10 watt, as soon as we hit 11 watt, right? So let's go ahead and I'll bump it up to 11 watt. Look at how much more frequently we can see the memory is bouncing between 400 megahertz and 800 megahertz. There is no in between. It's not like 430 megahertz. It's literally just going up and down, trying to interpolate a frequency between them. Now, we're just taking a look at the technical aspects of this. We'll be taking a look at what that means in terms of actual bandwidth in the next frame. But let's go ahead and step through. We're going to go to 12 watt. Once we hit 12 watt CDP, effectively, the memory is more consistently running at 800 megahertz. This will give us better bandwidth inside of that, but again, I think that we'd be better off running with a more fine-tuned clock and more fine-tuned voltages, but this is how AMD is doing things. So if we step through again and we go up to 13 watt, you can see now we're going from 800 megahertz to the top LPDDR5X 8000 megatransfers, which is 1 gigahertz. So we're oscillating between 800 megahertz and 1 gigahertz now. So as we go forward, you can see that when we go 14 watt, it's actually more of a clean 800 megahertz. As we start pushing more and more power into it, going from 10 watt to 20 watt, we can see that it's getting closer and closer to oscillating more frequently between 800 and 1 gigahertz. So we're effectively trying to get more bandwidth out of this space. And the next slide that I show you, the next graph that I'm going to show you, you're going to see how that actually translates into actual numbers. So once we keep on going and we push more power into it, effectively, when we hit 20 watt, you can see that we're more in line with basically being at 1 gigahertz on memory, which is pretty much the maximum that it can go to. However, it will oscillate still to 800 megahertz all the way basically to 24 watt. If we keep on stepping through this, you're going to see that it does oscillate as power goes. We're dipping down there, but like you can see in real time how AMD is generally trying to conserve power on the memory and memory controller side by just interpolating frequency, by just oscillating between 800, but between set frequencies instead of trying to bullseye a specific memory controller and voltage for a given TDP. Instead, it oscillates between them. I don't think that this is the most optimal way, but it does work and we do get better power. However, when we take a look at some synthetic benchmarks, especially in gaming, we can see that there's a pretty bad low in the 14 to 20 watt area. Okay, so now the graph has changed a little bit. Now we can see that we have average bandwidth in gigabyte, and over there we have TDP in watts. So we have 10 watt TDP, and you can see that we have 99 gigabytes a second in bandwidth. And if we go to the next set, at 11 watt, we have 121 gigabytes a second. At 12 watt, we have 141 gigabytes a second. We've already exceeded what has been largely possible on handhelds at this point. At 13 watt TDP, we're blowing past it. We have 168 gigabytes a second of bandwidth. At 14 watt, 172. At 15, 173. So again, keep this in mind. See how bandwidth is kind of not evenly spacing out again? When we take a look at the synthetic benchmarks, as we take a look at Heaven, this should paint a clearer picture where we're having a deficiency. And again, if AMD were to optimize this, we could really get much, much better results at lower TDPs. And when we go to 16 watt, 174 gigabytes, 17 watt, 177 gigabytes, 18 watt, 181 gigabytes, and so on and so forth. And you can see that it keeps climbing up to basically at 24 watt, we're at 217 gigabytes a second. This is an actual test. Obviously, theoretical is a lot higher than this, but in actual testing the bandwidth and across the entire VRAM spectrum. So I'm testing the 8 gigabytes of space that I have at every one of these. And if we just keep on going forward, you can see that we're going to basically peter out at about 218 gigabytes a second in bandwidth. So that's the maximum bandwidth, generally speaking, in real time that is going to be happening. So this is what is available to the GPU to get work done. But if you take a look, let me go ahead and zoom in on this portion right here, or at least highlight it on the screen. You can see right here that as we're pushing more power into it, we're really not doing a good enough job in trying to extract more bandwidth out of the memory of the memory controller. And as a result, when we take a look at how things look on Heaven and synthetic benchmarks, it's not as good. So let's go ahead and take a look at that. All right, so up first, we're going to be taking a look at the Heaven 720p. This is the lowest settings. So we're really going to be trying to make a more CPU bound situation. So this is going to show you how far we can push the CPU. And if you look above me, you can see, let me go ahead and zoom in on here just so you can see it. You can see that we're actually hitting average frame rates of average FPS of 456 FPS a second. So we're doing really, really good on this platform and being able to push for super high frame rate. If you wanted to go in that direction on this platform, you can totally do it. The green line is obviously the 395, and then the orange line is the 390. So we have a clear gap between both of those. It's rather large between both of them. But let's go ahead and focus in on the lower end of things. Now, let's go ahead and take a look at our graph. So we have the blue is the Ayaneo-kun, red is the GPD Max 2, the 8840U running 7500 megatransfers. The yellow is the GPD Duo, the HX370 at 7500 megatransfers. And then green and orange are the 395 and the 390. So let's go to the bottom left of this and just get a better idea. So right here, you can see that we're basically at 10 watt. And if you take a look, you can see that the 395 doesn't actually start working until about 5, 6, 7 watt. And likewise, for the 390, it doesn't actually start doing work until, basically 10 watts. So we have 8 watt here and 10 watt here. So this is the 390 and this is the 395. The blue line here is the Ayaneo-kun, and we can see that at least at 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, we're still beating the Ayaneo-kun. But for those more advanced platforms like the 8840 or the HX370, we can see that these yellow and red lines right here, that we're beating the 395 considerably at lower TDPs. But one thing that I want you to kind of pay attention to is right here in this bracket. So we're right in between, just so you can see. So this is 10 watt and 20 watt. And inside of 10 watt and 20 watt, take a look at this green line. And you can see how it just basically becomes a straight line. Remember, again, when we take a look at our memory bandwidth, that same type of line that had happened before. So when we understand the bandwidth that's working inside that same space, we get the same general profile when it comes to what's being able to be possible to drive on that machine. Basically at 20 watt, which you can see, which this line right here, that's where things start to converge, and where the 395 starts to really take off, especially on high frame rate types of scenarios where you want to try to achieve a very high frame rate. Largely at 20 watt, these are where these platforms start to peter off at. But as we go up, we can see that both the 395 on the green line and the 390 on the orange line still have a lot more room as we push more power into it. This is going to be 40 watt, this is 50 watt, and this is 60 watt, and that's 70 watt. So you can see how far this goes in synthetic benchmarks compared to the other platforms. But even though it's not absolutely fantastic at the lower end when pushing for CPU bound, very high frame rate, we still do get pretty good results. And especially compared to like the Ayaneo-kun, we're doing better than that pretty much everywhere. So only the previous generations, the 8840U and the HX370, do a much better job than the 395. The 390 is a bit of a slouch up until about 20 watt till we beat the Ayaneo-kun, and then it takes off. But if you just take a look at this, we're pretty much always better than the 390. The 395 is always better than the 390, watt for watt everywhere, even at the low end. And this will actually reflect also in the battery life side of things as well. So when we take a look at battery life at the low end, the 395 is actually going to do better because we can run at lower wattage than the 390 can, which is a little bit wild. We'll get into that in a second. Let's get into the next synthetic bench. We're going to do 720p high settings. All right, and again, we're now looking at the high end, right? We're going to be pushing more to a GPU bound situation. We're still running 720p, but we're doing max tessellation. We're using ultra settings. We're really pushing the GPU. And this is where things are going to start really converging a lot more rather than having the headroom for the CPU to boost up at lower TDPs. We can see that the 395 at basically 8 watt beats everything else out in a GPU-focused result at the low end. The 390, this orange line that you see right here, this needs around, I think it's actually 10 watt, right? This is a 1, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. Yeah, 10 and 13 and 14. So effectively, we need around like 10 watt on the 390 at a GPU bound situation before it actually starts doing work, and 14 watt on the 390. So we have a 4 watt difference before the 390 actually does work, versus we can actually run a 10 watt on the 395. That seems counterintuitive, but that is actually the case. The 395 can run at much lower TDPs. One of the whole CCXs can actually completely disable, and on 390, it's kind of a mess. Anyway, if we kind of like follow along, you can see the iNeoCoon is the worst of the bunch. But if we take a look at the HX370 or the 8840 on the GPD Max 2 or the GPD Duo, we can see that it's kind of, beating everything up until 20 watt. And at 20 watt, everything kind of gets left in the dust for the 390 and the 395. And as we go along, we can see how this kind of trends. And when we kind of zoom out here, we can see that we effectively get more than 2x performance. Obviously, if we go to, this is going to 80 watt versus topping out at 40 watt here. But even if we were to just go to 210 right here, we're only going to about 50 watt on the 395. So we can double the performance from the HX370 while using around 10 watts more. So that's how big of a difference things get. Obviously, as we push more power into it, we can extract a little bit more, but we start really getting diminishing returns right around the 50 watt mark. This becomes more evident when we even challenge the GPU even more by going to 1080p while still having max settings. So let's take a look at 1080p, but we're just going to take a look at the 390 and the 395. And here's what 1080p looks like max using max settings on having the synthetic benchmark while doing a per watt test between the 395 and the 390. Now, when we take a look at this, again, if we do 10 watt, we do 10, 11. So at 12 watt, we need 12 watt on the 395 before it actually does anything. It will not do anything at lower wattages. It just will not. It will require and extract to at least 12 watts. Likewise, we need at least 14 watt on the 390 as well. So between both of these, you can see that we're clearly doing more work using less wattage on the 395, and it has that same type of distance regardless of where it is. So per TDP, the 395 is just better than the 390. Everywhere you look at it, it almost doesn't even make sense for the 390 to exist unless there was a large price difference. And really, there doesn't appear to be that much of a price difference between them. So I don't know, it's almost impossible to recommend the 390 at all, given that the 395 runs at lower power, and at per watt, it does 10 to 20% better everywhere you look. So, I mean, if the price difference is only 10 to 20% difference between a 390 or a 395 part, the money you spend is going to be reflective of the performance you get at even at a base level. So just looking at this should give you a good idea that even at 40 watt, we start to peter out. When we hit like 45 watt, you can see we hit this clear wall right here. And this is where basically at 40 watt, there's just massive diminishing returns. So as we go up in resolution, push more on GPU, this is going to become more evident. And just pushing more power really isn't going to help us because we're just out of bandwidth and out of GPU at this moment. So that's a look at the GPU side of things on these two platforms. Let's go ahead and take a look at the CPU side of things, knowing all of my testing methodology. Now, again, all my gaming benchmarks are EPP90. The VRAM is at 8 gigabytes. Core isolation is disabled. All of that is the same, except I changed EPP to 0, so I'm pushing as much power as possible for the CPU side of things. Let's go ahead and take a look at both single-core results and multi-core results on Cinebench 2024. All right, I'm gonna have to zoom in on this just because there's so much data. I'm basically going from 5 watt all the way up to 80 watt. I'm doing per watt tests on single core and multi-core results on the 390 and the 395. Effectively, this is 300 benches. This one graph that you're seeing right here, again, I'm gonna post it on my Patreon just so that people can have the full resolution and they can kind of zoom in and take a look at it. I'm also gonna give the data on my Patreon, and that will be coming later to Twitter later on as well. Trying to figure out the best way to do this data is a bit hard. So you can see at 5 watt, this is the single core result, 6 watt, 7 watt, 8 watt, 9 watt, 10 watt. So let's find out at what wattage do we really start getting diminishing returns. And effectively at 20 watt, right around here. Now, again, this is single core results. So effectively, as we, it really just stops at 115 right here for the 395. And you can see that we have that clear difference between the 395 and 390 all the time as well. So at 115 single core result for Cinebench 2024 right here, 20, 21, 22, 23, 24, at basically at 24, 25 watt, that is the maximum power we can put into one core to achieve this result, which means that you could basically say, okay, if 23 watts can go into each core at its maximum frequency, if you just multiply that by 16, so you're looking at like almost 350 watts needed. If you had the 395 and you pushed all of the cores at max frequency, all core, it would be chewing up like 330, 340 watts just for the CPU side alone. Now, obviously, it's not going to do that. You need a crazy amount of cooling to achieve that. And whatever VRMs and whatever is driving power to it, I don't even think it can. So just to give you an idea of how much power these things could actually scale to, if there was no cap or no governor on them, it could get kind of out of control really fast. So, but effectively, 20 watt is where per core is where we start having massive diminishing returns. So we have basically 111 score on our single core result for Cinebench 2024, just to give you an idea of where that is. Let's go to multi-core results. All right, so again, this is again a tremendous amount of data. More data will be easily available on Patreon, and I'll share it on Twitter later on as well. These are multi-core results, and it's actually going to be a lot more fluid because we're going to be pushing power to all cores, and it's going to be more evenly distributed, especially as we go up to 80 watt. Now, again, I'm EPP0. I'm pushing fans as hard as they can. This device can actually support going up to 80 watt. It generally at 70 watt is going to be like guaranteed that it can do. 80 watts going to be pushing it. You're going to need a little bit better cooling, at least ambient wise, to get in there. At 20 watt, you can see what the results are here. As we go up to 80 watt, you can see that, I mean, it keeps on going, but more or less, we start tapping at around 70 watt, which is a score of 1647 for the 395 or 1379 for the 390, which is very good results for both of them. But the 395, especially the difference between both of them, and if the price difference isn't that much, again, why wouldn't you just get the 395? The money, extra money to go to 395 is well worth it. So we're going to go off here and we're going to go straight into battery life. All right. So now when we talk about battery life on Strix Halo, the Strix Halo platform, insofar at least on Asus's tablets, the Z13 Flow, the battery life that most everyone is going to get is not going to be all that great because the power profiles that we have on the system, that being silent, performance, turbo, and then manual, all of these are really just going to be, even in silent, you're really going to be in like the 20, 25 watt on battery at a lowest. And even when you play indie games that have no business using all that power, it will just use it largely because of the power profile on Windows, how AMD is doing things. So I'm going to show you a video of like how I have been able to get much better battery life by forcing it into a much lower state. So you can see right now, package power is around 7 watt. That'll go down to about 6 watt. You can see it went down to 6 watt when it played. So it's going to fluctuate between 6 and 7 watt. Total system power right now, what you see is 9.2 watt. That is just because I just started recording. This will start averaging down to about 7.5 watt total system power. What that means is that effectively, we're going to get close to like 9 hours of battery life in this particular case. Now, on the 395, we actually get better power characteristics than the 390, which it has less. It has less GPU and less CPU, but it requires more power. And that'll be reflective in the battery charts that I'm going to show you. In terms of like the absolute best case, for people that have the means of being able to force these systems into lower TDPs and stuff, most people are probably going to say that Strix Halo doesn't have that good a battery life. The reality is that it can, it just requires people to have the means to do so. So really when it comes down to is like a best case scenario of what we're able to achieve, the red line that you see right here, this is the 395, and we're basically getting around nine hours of battery life. The blue line that you see right here, it's going to end somewhere like right around here, so 7.5 hours. I'm covering up a little, but it's basically 7.5 hours. So you can see that we're using, you can see right there, 7.1 watt, 7.2 watt. Now what's really interesting here, I'm going to go ahead and stop that for a moment and actually bring this back. So let's go ahead and zoom in right over here. Take a look at what we're looking at effectively is the current TDP and total system power. Take a look at the total system power versus the TDP, the package power that's running. Effectively, we're at like 6 watts or so for package power, right? And for total system power, we're at 7.6 watts. So it means like 1.5 watts is for the RAM, the display, the SSD, the Wi-Fi, literally everything else to be running. So one thing that's not running here, because I'm in Asus's silent mode, in Asus's silent mode, what happens is if it's under a certain threshold, the fans are actually completely off. So by the fans not being on, we also get a significant power savings by the fan being off. And that results in basically 1.5 watt difference between whatever the package power is and what the total system power is. The end result is that we get 9 hours of battery life. If we go ahead and play this again, and take a look at the 390 with the green lines, you can see if we just go ahead and stop this for a second and then zoom in over here, what we should be able to see is that we're basically chewing an extra whole watt of power on the 390. Now, let's zoom back out again. I am not forcing this to happen. I put both of these at 4 watt. And this is just how much power the system is using. Like I am trying to force it to use less. And even with EPP 90 and just saying 4 watt, this is what the system is just using. The 390 just uses more power. Like I had shown in the synthetic benchmarks of the Heaven benchmarks, we can see that the 395 and the 390 basically have this 2 4 watt difference before either one of them kicks in. And the 395 often is better. So we'll go ahead and press play here. Just to finish this off, and the 390 just ends right around here. So I'm gonna go ahead and stop it. And you can see just before we lost power, I'll go ahead and zoom in right over here. The system tried like going into a lower power state. Effectively, Celeste is no longer running at 60 FPS here. It's running at like 30 FPS. But you can see that the system goes into its absolute lowest power state, which is effectively 5.5 watt, 5 watt or so. And then we can see the total system power is around 7.3 watt. So that is a best case scenario, this particular graph. The 395 can get around 9 hours of battery life, and the 390 can get 7.5 hours battery life. But this requires people to have the means to control TDP themselves, which by Asus's own stuff, they don't offer to you. So let's go into a situation where let's see what other people are actually going to be getting. So with the silent profile, this graph is going to show you what the battery life is like on this. Now, because the 390 actually got slightly better battery life here, it's coming up first and is the red line. So I apologize, this is getting flip-flopped. The blue line is now the 395. The red line, you can see, well, it's behind me, effectively gets 2 hours of battery life, and the 395 gets an hour and 50 minutes of battery life, so effectively a 10-minute difference, better for the 390. And what we can see here is on this yellow line, we can see that we're using around 35 watts total system power at the end of everything as we approach the end of the voltage that's applied on the battery. And even though, I'm going to pause it right here, and even though the 390, you can see along this entire green and orange line versus the green and yellow line up here, even though we're using effectively the same package power, we're still using an extra watt on the 395. Now, I'm sure that I had both of these set to 50% brightness, so everything is pretty much equal between these, but the 390 is getting better battery life here. So just keep that in mind that we are getting around 10 minutes of better battery life on the 390. If that matters or much to you at all, it's up to you. Ultimately, I still recommend the 395, and we'll get into that later on in this video as well. Cumulatively, with every bit of information that I give in this review, this is just a silent mode, and we could get absolutely atrocious battery life by pushing this to 80 watts. You'll have around, I don't know, 30 to 40 minutes of battery life. Instead, we're going to take a look at the performance profile in the Asus Armory crate. So let's go ahead and take a look at the performance profile. All right, so this is the graph that we're going to be taking a look at the performance profile. And again, the red line is the 390. But if we take a look, we can see that this line right here is basically the hour mark. And over here, we're getting like an hour and 20 minutes. The 395 is basically in line, but again, we still get slightly worse performance battery life-wise on the 395. This is the running package power versus the total system power. Let's take a brief pause here. You can see right up over there that as we're making a big demand from the system, as we're hitting the 20% mark on the battery, the system kind of locks in and we jot down to about 27 watt on the performance profile, and now we're using 47 watt total, and this will end at about an hour and 20 minutes. Likewise, here is the 395, but the 395 doesn't seem to really engage at the 20% mark and just keeps on going. So you can see that we're using around 62 watts towards the end of the battery, especially with how like voltage is going down and how the demand on amps is increasing. So this is reflective of what you're going to have. Effectively, the performance mode on the 395 on battery is 1 hour. So keep that in mind, that when you're running like this, that you're not going to have the best battery life if you're just using the Armory crate profiles. You really need to use other tools as they become available, like I'm using now, to really extract better battery life on this, which may be more than most people are really looking to do. But at a default setting, this thing's going to chew through power by default, even though it doesn't really necessarily need to. So for the first set of benchmarks that we're going to be taking a look at, we're going to be taking a look at Strix Halo, the Halo part of Strix Halo, which is the Max Plus 395 version, which we've already shown earlier on in this video that the 395 is better at every watt everywhere compared to the 390. I am still very interested in the 380, but I don't know if I'll be able to get my hands on any 380 parts anytime soon. But for now, we know that the 395 is superior everywhere compared to the 390. So we're just going to be taking a look at it from the viewpoint of the 395. And this is basically to, once again, reiterate that I have always felt that Strix Halo could go low, and there's a lot of people that told me that it just wasn't possible, and it was kind of silly for me to suggest so. But because I've been looking at this device for so long and messing around with the memory controller part of these on Encore, that I knew more than most people, and I was correct. Now, if we were talking about how expensive this would be, it is cost prohibitive to put Strix Halo into a handheld, so I don't think cost-wise it would make sense. But 256-bit wide memory can 100% work inside of a handheld with a smaller overall GPU and a much smaller CPU configuration. Also, if it was monolithic instead of how the Strix Halo is, which is just a gigantic monster. So I think that if AMD made a specific handheld part with 256 watt memory, we could have our cake and eat it too at the low end, and also when docked, go pretty far. So we're going to show off the low end and the high end compared to the 390, but right now we're just going to be focusing on comparing it to the 8840U as well as HX370, so Strix Point, which is closer to AMD Z2E that is not yet available, but should be what it is. The HX370 should be the Z2E, most likely with the XNDNA stuff slice off or disabled. So this game that we're taking a look at is Batman Arkham Knight 720p max settings. When we take a look at 15 watt, the 8840U versus 395, we can see that 395 is basically similar in averages. If we take a look at 1 percentile, 8840U is winning by about 12-13%. And if we take a look at 0.2 percentile, 8840U is winning around 15%. So 8840U is winning in the 1 percentile and 0.2 percentile, to be expected. But we are still pretty good on the Max 395. Once we go to 20 watt, things drastically change. So we're around, remember, if you take a look at the shaded part right up here, all of the shaded cells are going to be the Max Plus 395. So we have the 20 watt right here and 20 watt for the 395 right here. If we take a look at our averages, we're 24% better on averages. We are actually only 2% better on 1 percentile, and we are exactly the same on 0.2 percentile. So we just have a 24% greater on averages. When we go to 25 watt, again, it's a big lead. 25 watt to 25 watt, it's 50% better on averages. When we take a look at 1 percentile, it's 26% better on 1 percentile and 23% better on 0.2 percentile. All of these are handheld TP, especially with the Asus ROG Ally, the Ally X, it can go up to 28 watt. So doing 25 watt and seeing this large increase, we're looking at a 50% increase on averages, almost 30% increase on 1 percentile. The AMD Strix Halo, the 395, is not a handheld chip by any means. It's a gigantic monster. And yet, we are competitive at 15 watt and 20 watt, and then we start blowing it out of the water once we go to 25 watt, and we still have a lot of leg room. We can go up to 45, 50 watt on Strix Point. That's how much space we have here, which is crazy impressive. And the next game we're going to be taking a look at is Cyberpunk 2077. I'm using the Steam Deck preset. I am running 720p native, so there is no upscaling whatsoever. We are resolving at 720p native. Now, what's interesting here is on Strix Halo, we do not have heterogeneous cores. We just have full fat Zen 5 cores and 16 of them. And Cyberpunk really loves CPU. But what's interesting is that one of the CCXs basically gets disabled all the time on these lower TDP results. So it's saving power by just completely disabling one CCX, and all of it's focused on the full fat good side of the 8 cores that Halo Strix has, and we just blow it out of the water. Now remember, all of these shaded parts are the Max Plus 395. So at 15 watt, which we have right here, this is the 8840U at 15 watt, and we're 17% better on averages. We are actually take a hit around 5% on 1 percentile. We also take around 11% hit on 0.2 percentile. So we're kind of mixed bag here. I would say that we still hit a 31 FPS on 1 percentile. So this is still actually really good on 15 watt for 395. If we go to 20 watt, now 20 watt up here is for the 395 and 20 watt for the 8840Us down here. On averages, we're 52% better. On 1 percentile, we're 39% better. And at 0.2 percentile, we're 38% better. So just destroying it inside the same wattages. Now, again, as I showed you earlier on in this video, when we take a look at total system power, it pretty much tracks at the low end with what handhelds do. So we're not really using more power on memory bus wise. So it kind of just evens out. When we take a look at 50% brightness on these tablets that I have versus a handheld, more or less total system power is effectively the same. So we get to have our cake and eat it too. And we go up to 25 watt on 8840U. Again, it's just a gigantic blowout. 71% better on averages, 52% better on 1 percentile, and then 42% better on 0.2 percentile. That's 25 watt to 25 watt. Now, again, Strix Halo goes up to 45 watt. So when we plug in and dock in, we can actually push it even farther. This is everything that I was saying about the Xbox Handheld that would be possible, is that we could go real low at 15 watt and just have a better handheld chip. Strix Halo is not a handheld chip. I'm going to say it a bazillion times, but it can go low, obviously, because I'm showing you the examples and I've showed you everything here. So really impressive results from the 395 with how much range it has. And it does really good at the low end, and it does really good at the high end. Now, Cyberpunk is one game that will really highlight having really good CPUs and the GPU, whereas on a handheld, we're really going to be highlighting the deficiencies there, as well as heterogeneous cores, especially when we show you the HX370 results. You're going to see how much worse it is on that platform on Cyberpunk. But let's go ahead and go to the next game. And the next game we'll be taking a look at is Deus Ex Mankind Divided. Running 720p, I'm still using the DirectX 11 backend, but I'm using ultra settings. So we're really challenging the GPU a lot here. Again, 395 should be showing off pretty well. At 15 watt on the 8840U, averages are around 4% better. However, we take a clear hit on 1 percentile. We're around 17% worse on 1 percentile and 9% worse on 0.2 percentile. It's probably a mixed bag. I would still say the 8840U is better here, but you know, no big deal. We'll go up to 20 watt. At 20 watt, things just take a gigantic turn. We're around 26% better on averages. On 1 percentile, we're around 15% better, and at 0.2 percentile, we're around 13% better. So clear jump, not as big as Cyberpunk, but still a decent chunk lead when we're inside the same package power. When we go to 25 watt, we're 56% better on averages. 41% better on 1 percentile, and 45% better on 0.2 percentile. So you can start to see where at 25 watt, we really start to trail off on other handhelds, the 8840U platform, which is really a laptop chip, but they stuff them in handhelds as well. We talk about the HX370 as well later on, but we can clearly see that at 15 watt, it's very competitive. And as we start pushing more wattage into it, it's just a clear blowout every time. So let's go ahead and go to the next game. And the next game we'll be taking a look at is Horizon Zero Dawn. We're running 720p and favorite performance. And this is one area where the 8840 just takes a clear lead over the Max Plus 395. We're around 15% better on averages, around 17% better on 1 percentile, but kind of the same on 0.2 percentile, around 3% difference. Clear lead for the 8840 at 15 watt. That's a clear win for 15 watt in so far as Horizon Zero Dawn. However, when we go up to 20 watt, we're around 9% better on averages for the 395, with 1 percentile around 8% better on 1 percentile, and around 25% better on 0.2 percentile. So a clear win for the 395. And when we go to 25 watt, we're 20% better on averages, 17% better on 1 percentile, and 30% better on 0.2 percentile. Again, I would still pick the 395 here, especially because when you dock at 395 goes even higher, and then we can go to 1080p max settings, which I'll be showing you later. But again, really good results for very low power for the 395. Let's go to the final game that we're taking a look at, comparing the 8840U to the Strix Halo 395 Max Plus. And the last game we'll be looking at is Returnal. We're running 720p, but we're using FSR2 balance, so we're upscaling to 720p, and we're using low settings. So the lowest settings possible, and we're using sub resolutions of 720p. When we look at 15 watt, it's just a gigantic blowout. 37% better, almost 38% better on averages, 17% better on 1 percentile, and 4% better on 0.2 percentile. Returnal is a very GPU bound game. So if we wanted to highlight GPU deficiencies or GPU efficiencies or better GPU, Returnal is one fantastic game to take a look at. And when we have 40 CU going wide and slow, even at 15 watt, when we don't have full bandwidth, we can still see that we're getting a gigantic lead in this area. When we go to 20 watt, it's just like, it's bad. So it's 77% better on averages, 38% better on 1 percentile, and 18% better on 0.2 percentile. But it's just a gigantic difference there. If we go to 25 watt, we're 104% better. So basically 2x in the same package power, right? So 25 watt to 25 watt, we are 2xing what is possible from those GPUs. If we take a look at 1 percentile, it's 59% better. And if we take a look at 0.2 percentile, it's 42% better. So again, package power is the same between both of these, 25 watt to 25 watt, yet a drastic difference just because of how giganto that GPU is on Strix Halo. Now, again, this is going to be the end of the 8840U. We're still going to be comparing to Strix 370, the HX370, which is like the Z2E. And we're also going to be comparing the 390 to the 395 Strix Halo parts. But we're going to be using 1080p just to get a better idea of where those two track. Now, we already took a look at previous benches comparing those two, so we should already know that 395 is basically going to win. But we'll go over those as well. But again, at the low end, Strix Halo does a really good job. So 256-bit wide memory is 100% possible in a handheld. There is no reason to have such a giganto GPU, though it would be nice. But we don't need so much CPU, and all of this would be much better if it was all just monolithic. Still having that 32 megabyte of cache on there as well, just because that is also nice. But taking a look at 8840U compared to Strix Halo, the 395 at lower TDPs, I think it's pretty clear that 395 holds its own at 15 watt and then really just destroys things at 20 and 25 watt and then goes even worse as we put more power into it. So hopefully that makes things clear of Strix Halo totally can be in a handheld and go to low power. Let's take a look at how it tracks against the HX370. In this part of the video, we're going to be comparing AMD's latest Strix Point HX370 versus their Strix Halo. This is the 395 parts of the big bad boy Strix Halo. Now, we're only going to take a look at 15 watt and 20 watt just so that we can keep it in the handheld sphere of things. The HX370 should be very close to what the AMD Z2E should be. Obviously, the Z2E would likely have those XeNDNA cores disabled like the Z1E was. Effectively, this is what we would anticipate for the Z2E. So let's go ahead and take a look. We're looking at Batman Arkham Knight 720p max settings. Now, the 395 does lose out to 15 watt on the HX370. We're looking around 7% better worse averages, and it takes a beating. So it's around 25% worse on 1 percentile, and also like 27% worse on 0.2 percentile. So HX370 clearly wins in Batman Arkham Knight, comparing at 15 watt. But once we go to 20 watt, things take a little bit of a turn. The 395 is about 6% better on averages. However, our 1 percentile is still much better on HX370, around 16% better on 1 percentile, and around 20% better on 0.2 percentile. So I would say that HX370 clearly wins in Batman Arkham Knight, but because it has those heterogeneous CPU cores, which kind of isn't great on Windows 11 24H2 yet, when we take a look at Cyberpunk, things are going to take a drastic turn. So let's take a look at Cyberpunk. And taking a look at Cyberpunk 2077, this is using the Steam Deck preset with 720p native. So there is no upscaling. We're just using 720p native. And here we can see how badly HX370 gets crushed by just having full-fat Zen 5 cores, no heterogeneous cores on the Strix Halo part. So on 395, it's just 16 Zen 5 cores. However, at low wattage, one of the CCXs is completely disabled, so we only have effectively 8 cores. We just destroy the HX370. So on averages, we're 39% better, 15 watt to 15 watt. When we take a look at 1 percentile, we're 13% better on 1 percentile, and we're around 10% better on 0.2 percentile. So 15 watt to 15 watt, just a clear blowout for the 395 compared to the HX370. When we take a look at 20 watt, it is just laughable how much better it is. 63% better on averages, 47% better on 1 percentile, and 45% better on 0.2 percentile at 20 watt. So really highlighting how bad those heterogeneous cores are on the HX370, especially on 24H2. It's just not a good showing. So this is something hopefully Microsoft fixes later on. It needs a lot of work, or at least Cyberpunk fixes whatever's going on over there. But just having straight cores, straight GPU cores, obviously Cyberpunk prefers that, and it is a clear win with the 395, both at 15 watt and 20 watt, just absolutely destroyed. When we compare 15 watt to 15 watt, the 395 is around 18% better on averages. However, we take a little bit of a backseat on 1 percentile. We lose around 4% on 1 percentile, and 0.2 percentile is around 2% better, basically negligible. Ultimately, the 395 is much better in the 15 watt range. When we go to 20 watt, it's even more exaggerated. We're looking at 32% better on averages. For 1 percentile, we're looking at 19% better on 1 percentile, and 0.2 percentile, it's 15% better. So again, a clear win for the 395, with only Batman Arkham Knight showing a much better advantage for the HX370. But in this particular game, 395 is just clearly winning. So we'll go to Horizon Zero Dawn and then cap it off with Returnal. So the next game we'll be taking a look at, comparing the HX370 to the Max Plus 395. We're looking at Horizon Zero Dawn. I'm running 720p with favorite performance. So 720p native, there's no upscaling to really have here. On averages, we're looking at 11% better on the 395. When we take a look at 1 percentile, only 3% better, and only 1% better on 0.2 percentile. So effectively 1 percentile, 0.2 percentile are effectively the same, but the averages are better. Clear win for the 395, but not drastic. When we go to 20 watt, it becomes sensationally different. 23% better on averages, 23% better on 1 percentile, and 25% better on 0.2 percentile. Again, same wattage, same package power between both of them, and total system power is also going to be very similar between 15 watt and 20 watt compared to these on handhelds. So again, Strix Point Halo can work on a handheld. It's just that it'd be too expensive. Not that there would be any power reasons on why it couldn't. Let's go to the last game, which is Returnal, and see where HX370 sits, because it does have a bigger GPU, so we'll see what the difference is. And the last game, we'll be comparing HX370 to the Max Plus 395. We're taking a look at Returnal, and if we take a look at averages, the 395 is only around 2% better on averages. Takes a small hit, effectively 1% worse on 1 percentile, and around 9% worse on 0.2 percentile. So more or less, I would say that the 370 wins here at 15 watt, but by no real margin. It's a coin flip on which one you're actually going to prefer. We go to 20 watt, though. That's when we have a clear difference on averages. We're looking at 22.5% better on averages, 4% better on 1 percentile. However, we do take a bit of a hit on 0.2 percentile. Again, close to that 8% which is interesting. That will do it for taking a look at the HX 370 versus the Strix Halo part, the Max Plus 395. This will conclude the game benchmarks of the low TDP side of things. The next set of gaming benchmarks we're going to be taking a look at will be comparing the 390 to the 395, both of those Strix Halo parts, and we're going to be bumping up to 1080p and more max settings while doing 35, 45, and 55 watt just to see where those sit. So let's go ahead and go to those gaming benchmarks to see when we plug in the device, how much better things get. All right, so now we're going to be comparing the higher end. So pushing more power into the platform, we're going to be taking a look at 35 watt, 45 watt, and 55 watt. And again, when we take a look at the benches that we did with the synthetic benchmarks, we can see that when we start pushing for higher resolutions and max settings, that we really start capping off at around 45 watt anyway. So I'm keeping it inside of that range. The only time that we're actually able to get better frame rate is by doing lower resolutions and then leaning heavier on CPU side, because then it becomes more of a CPU bound problem, and the CPUs can obviously tackle that. So we can get to like 400 FPS in very low resolution games. But because we're trying to do more graphic fidelity in these particular tests, we're going to be leaning harder on larger resolutions as well as settings. So again, with the Max Plus 395, I'm going to be tinting it in this like gray outline here, just so it's easier to track and follow along when I'm going through this. And honestly, when I did Batman Arkham Knight, which we can see here, it's 1080p in max settings, but I really should have just did 1440p because 1080p were being CPU bound in this particular test, and they all kind of smushed together. So apologies, I already did this test, but we're just going to use them. At 35 watt, the 395 is around 15% better than the 390 inside, both at 35 watt. Our 1 percentile is around 9% better, and our 0.2 percentile is 17% better on the 395. So again, as we saw previously, the 395 per watt everywhere across everything is just better on the 395, and that continues to be the case. When we go to 45 watt, comparing the 390 to the 395, we're only 7% better on averages, 9% better on 1 percentile, and 22% better on 0.2 percentile. So things start like kind of merging together at this point. I don't think you'd really have that much of a problem. At 55 watt, it shows it at the top because of averages. So averages wise, the 395 is only about 1% worse. However, our 1 percentile is 2% better on 395, as well as our 0.2 percentile being around 15% better. So ultimately, the 395 is still better, but I mean, at these particular settings, I should have just pushed for greater resolution, but we'll start looking at other games where we can actually make use of that, especially with Cyberpunk. When I do 1080p and I go to high settings, is Cyberpunk 2077. I'm using the Steam Deck preset still. However, we bumped it up to 1080p native. So again, no upscaling, so we're just resolving a 1080p native, and we're still getting really good results here. The 390 is the worst of the bunch, and we have real clear leads on the 395. We take a look at 35 watt versus 35 watt on the 395. The 35 watt is in this particular section, this grayed out section right here. We're looking at 67% better on averages. We're 45% better on 1 percentile, and 43% better on 0.2 percentile. Now, I double check this just as a quick aside here, just so that I could validate with you. I redid this benchmark and captured it for you just so you can see it. We are running the Steam Deck preset. However, I am disabling FSR2, so it is 1080p native that we're running at this, and I am running at 35 watt. And when we go through this entire benchmark, you can see that it ends out being 96 FPS average. And we take a look back here on the averages here, we can see I had 92.7 on the 395 results. So this is mathing out. We actually do get the 395 at 35 watt is just trouncing the 390. If we go up to the 45 watt, we can see that averages are 60% better on 395, 40% better on 1 percentile, and 37% better on 0.2 percentile, which is a clear blowout. And at 55 watt, we're 47% better on averages, 26% better on 1 percentile, and 20% better on 0.2 percentile. So Cyberpunk 2077, again, because of how that 390 is just managing those CPUs, is really doing a poor job. So perhaps we just got the junk of the litter for the 390, but it's becoming self-evident that it's hard to recommend the 390. And the next game we're going to be taking a look at is Deus Ex Mankind Divided. I am still using the DirectX 11 backend. However, we did bump this up to 1080p, and we are still using those ultra settings. So we're really going to be taxing the GPU on these platforms. On the 390 versus the 395, we have a 26% difference on averages. On 1 percentile, it's 22% difference. And on 0.2 percentile, it's 27% difference. So clear lead at the same package power for 395, totally worth it. When we go to 45 watt, again, if on the gray bar up here that you can see it, our averages are 19% better on averages, only 5% on 1 percentile, and only 3% on 0.2 percentile. For 55 watt, we have 9% better on averages, 3% better on 1 percentile, and 5% better on 0.2 percentile. So as we push more power into it, the gap considerably closes between these two platforms, and it becomes less of a good reason to have the 395 in this particular instance. But I still think the 395 is something that I would ultimately still advise people to get. But let's go to the next game. So the next game we'll be looking at is Horizon Zero Dawn. I'll be doing 1080p, however, not favorite performance settings. This is the maximum ultra settings. So we're really going to be stressing the GPU both on render resolution as well as settings. We take a look at 35 watt between the 390 and 395. We're 15% better on the 395. On averages, only 4% better on 1 percentile and only 6% better on 0.2 percentile. Going up to 45 watt, again, this is fairly even, thankfully. We're looking at 11% better on averages for 395, 4% better on 1 percentile. However, we take around a 9% dip on 0.2 percentile with the 390 picking it up. On averages for 55 watt, only 4% difference. Again, 1 percentile actually takes a hit. We're 5% better on 390 and effectively the same on 0.2 percentile. So this is a better showing for the 390 comparing the 390 to the 395, where it's a little bit more even and we can kind of see where we are bandwidth bound, where all things else being not a problem. So we're going to go to our last game, which is Returnal, and we're going to be looking at how the GPU gets stressed. So let's take a look at that. Alrighty, and our last game that we'll be taking a look at, this is Returnal. I'm running 1080p native. There is no upscaling whatsoever, and I'm using high settings as well. So pretty beefy settings, and this is where we're really going to be highlighting that where that extra GPU grit comes from on the 40 CU part on the Max Plus 395 versus the 32 CU part on the 390. When we take a look at 35 watt, again, all of the Max Plus 395s are over here. So even 35 watt, the Max Plus 395 is being 55 watt on the 390. So 35 watt compared to 35 watt, we're 59%, 58% better on averages, 32% better on 1 percentile, and 150% better than on 0.2 percentile. It's a gigantic difference between the two. On 45 watt, we're looking at 51% better on averages, 14% better on 1 percentile, and 27% better on 0.2 percentile. At 55 watt, we're looking at 41% better on the 395 on averages. For 1 percentile, it's 2x. It's a clean 2x. And 0.2 percentile, it's 87% better. So clearly the 395 is basically double better in a lot of regards for Returnal. Now, this is a very GPU-focused game. So any game that is going to be challenging the GPU a bunch, going, as wide as possible and getting as much work as we can get done within that bandwidth is going to pay dividends. So whatever game is going to be coming out that is Returnal-like, where it's just so GPU focused, you're really going to see a lot of benefit for the Max Plus 395, whereas the 390 is obviously struggling. So that caps it off for the game benchmarks comparing all these platforms. We took a look at the low end, we compared it at the high end. Hopefully this gives you a better overall look on what these two platforms offer. Ultimately, I still recommend the Max Plus 395 over the 390, but that's it. So let's go ahead and get on to the last parts of this review video. So hopefully you've actually made it to the end of this video where I can actually get to the, can I recommend the ROG Flow Z13 tablet? The answer is yes, I can, and for a lot of different reasons. Now, I don't recommend the 390 version at all. If you are interested in this platform at all, just spend the extra $200 to get to the 395. The 10% cost difference for 15 to 20% at a baseline better performance, and then some for a lot of different use cases, makes the 395 an easy recommend, right? Like if you're already interested in this, the 395 is the only version you should be looking at. All of my benchmarks should show that data and make it self-evident to you. Where this gets kind of weird is if you were looking at this from a gaming system point of view, there are gaming laptops that are going to be cheaper that can get similar types of performance. So I don't think it's going to be very recommendable in that avenue. But when we take a look at the 128 gigabyte model or even the 64 gigabyte model, when we think about large language models that can fit inside that data set with that giganto GPU and very fast memory, then it becomes super compelling because all of that power and memory inside of like even the 128 gigabyte model for like 27 or 2800 dollars, that's actually economical for all the other different solutions that are out there. To have a super powerful local instance that you can do on your local machine is very compelling. So I almost would think that the 128 gigabyte model is going to sell rather well. Ultimately, yes, I can recommend it. The current power profiles that are there are going to, if that's the only thing that you're going to be using, those are not going to give you sensational battery life, but it'll give you a reasonable performance even at its very low end. The silent version, the silent profile is very silent and you can still get very good performance out of it. Yes, it is easy to recommend from that angle because it is a fantastic workstation. You have 16 full fat Zen 5 cores that can do a ton of work. You also have 40 CUs of that RDNA 3.5 GPU and 256-bit wide LPDDR5X 8000 megatransfer or running at 1 gigahertz. It's just a bunch of tech crammed into a small form factor. Thank you very much to my YouTube channel members as well as my Patreon members. Your support really does mean the world to me, guys. I hope this video was informative. As always, guys, thank you for your time, and thanks for watching.